Hey everyone, this is a review of Sean Matgamna's The Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, the Two Trotskyisms Confront Stalinism, edited by Sean Matgamna. This review is by Paul Hampton, and the review is titled Beyond the Fragments of the Trotskyist Movement. So here we go. Why is the revolutionary left today in such a mess? Why are the politics of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Socialist Party, the various Fourth Internationals, and most of the splinters, grouplets, and fragments so incoherent? When did it start to go wrong for the classical Marxist tradition, which had reached such a flowering with Lenin, Trotsky, and other Bolsheviks? And what were the alternatives, the roads not taken or barely trodden, which might help orient Marxists today in the situation we start from? The Alliance for Workers' Liberty's new book, a second volume of documents from the early Trotskyist movement, goes a long way towards answering those questions. The short answers are clear and deserve repetition. Between 1917 and 1923, working-class movements could have taken power into their own hands and built socialist societies across the globe. The rise and development of Stalinism obliterated this generation of worker militants. Although this was resisted by the tiny band of Trotskyists who remained true to the potential of the Russian Workers' Revolution of 1917, after 1940, these forces too succumbed to Stalinist and semi-Stalinist politics. What was codified as, quote, Orthodox Trotskyism, end quote, after the Second World War, even those like the British Socialist Workers' Party that appeared to be different, in fact largely collapsed into Stalinoid totalitarian conceptions of socialism, revolution, the party, and much else. This, quote, orthodoxy, end quote, displaced the working class from the irreplaceable role of the self-conscious agency. This, quote, orthodoxy displaced the working class from the irreplaceable role as the self-conscious agency for the working class's own emancipation, making Stalinist states, peasant armies, military despots, and religious fanatics the substitute, quote, progressive, end quote, force, with the revolutionary left reduced to a cheerleading satellite. This book is part of a comprehensive Alliance for Workers' Liberty effort to understand the defeat of the working class and its socialist vanguard in the 20th century. Is organized around three significant parts. 1. Further documentation and interpretation of the 1939-40 split in the Trotskyist movement. 2. The desperate course taken by the American Socialist Workers' Party led by James Cannon during the war, which laid the basis for, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyism in the post-war period. 3. The alternative course taken by the heterodox Third Camp forces around Max Shachtman, which continued and developed the classical Marxist legacy of Trotsky into the new period. Although the book includes other essays and documents of great interest, these three themes organize the texts and shed new light on this pivotal period. First, new section, 1939-40. The Alliance for Workers' Liberty's book, The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Volume 1, published in 1998, included a substantial selection of documents from the 1939-40 split in the American Socialist Workers' Party, the most significant Trotskyist group in the world at that time. The new book adds to this record, for example, by publishing the set-piece debate between Cannon and Shachtman. This was a gladiatorial contest that suggests a higher level of political culture at the time on both sides of the debate, something the left today must learn again if it is to progress. Long-forgotten documents show the responses of participants to the Russian invasion of Poland, then Finland, and later the Baltic states. The divisions between Cannon's and Shachtman's factions are shown to be very different to the impression from books such as Trotsky's In Defense of Marxism or Cannon's The Struggle for the Proletarian Party. These books present Cannon's group as the consistent Trotskyists, united in their political assessment of the USSR as a worker state, and resolute in their political conclusions to defend the USSR. In reality, they were heavily dependent on Trotsky's conjunctural and often mistaken analysis of swiftly moving events, deeply divided themselves between supporters and opponents of those invasions, and highly intolerant of engaging the minority politically. The short-term result in 1939-40 was not a rational debate about the expansion of the USSR's class nature, or what political stance to take on its foreign policy. These matters are scarcely discussed adequately at all. Instead, there was a botched, truncated debate with the minority smeared as, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, and then expelled because it wanted to produce a public bulletin articulating its politics. This split sparked the development of, quote, apparatus Marxism, end quote, within the Trotskyist movement, combining the same political dogmatism and organizational monolithism that Zinoviev had provided for Stalin's rise to dominance decades later. Matgamna argues that apparatus Marxism is, quote, a peculiarly rancid species of, quote, Marxism, end quote, from which everything, quote, objective, end quote, disinterested and spontaneous and creative is banished, end quote. Creativity is, quote, incompatible with the prime function of, quote, apparatus Marxism, end quote, rationalizing for, quote, the party, end quote, and the party's apparatus. Creativity, and so to speak, spontaneity, is the prerogative of the all-shaping, suck-it-and-see empirical citizens who staff the, quote, party, end quote, apparatus. Everything is thereby turned on its head, end quote. Sean Matgamna. The history of the, quote, Orthodox, end quote, Trotskyist or Cannonite organizations is, quote, a story shaped by this conception of the relationship of Marxism to, quote, the Revolutionary Party, end quote, as a handmaiden of the apparatus, end quote. Matgamna. Apparatus Marxism is both, quote, blind and sterile because apparatus Marxism is not and cannot be a guide to honest analysis and to practice consistent with theory. Apparatus Marxism exists to rationalize a practice that is in fact guided by something else, usually the perceived advantage of the organization, end quote. Matgamna. New section. USSR. The Second World War in Europe began with the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939, but turned with Hitler's invasion of the USSR in June 1941. The reaction of the, quote, Orthodox, end quote, American Socialist Workers' Party to this attack was to elevate, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, into a justification for illusion-breeding support for the USSR and a left cover for Stalinism. The book documents the dreadful array of articles supporting Stalin's regime, which made a mockery of the anti-Stalinist politics of the American Socialist Workers' Party, claimed to take from Trotsky. The, quote, Orthodox lauded, quote, Soviet patriotism, end quote, arguing that the, quote, Soviet masses, end quote, were fighting to defend the gains of the October 1917 revolution, which had long been extinguished. The Red Army's morale, quote, astonished, end quote, the Red Army's enemies, while, quote, Soviet soldiers fight bravely because they have something worth defending, end quote. The American Socialist Workers' Party. Socialist Workers' Party leaders claimed that it wasn't Stalin's Red Army, but Trotsky's. Trotsky had last led the Red Army in 1921, was expelled from Russia in 1929, and then killed by Stalin's agents in 1940. Trotskyists were incarcerated and murdered in Russia, while the Russian army was purged in the late 1930s. Yet for the, quote, Orthodox, end quote, the name of Leon Trotsky is inseparably bound up with the formation, life and victories of the Red Army, end quote. Cannon rebuked the party's paper's editors, who had criticized the Red Army for standing outside Warsaw, while the Nazi armies massacred the uprising in 1944. This was a million miles from Trotsky and authentic Marxism. As the USSR turned the tide and defeated the Nazis, the USSR seized large territories and countries. A Socialist Workers' Party resolution in February 1946 advocated that workers in Eastern Europe, quote, tolerate the presence of the Red Army, end quote, in the name of its alleged help in, quote, the fulfillment of agrarian reform and the statization of the means of production, end quote. As the USSR pillaged war-torn Europe, displacing millions, imposing forced labor and its own puppets, the, quote, Orthodox, end quote, continued to fetishize, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, and eventually to conclude that the Stalinists had made, quote, socialist, end quote, revolutions in Eastern Europe without and against the working classes of those countries. For the, quote, Orthodox, end quote, the scratch had turned to gangrene. The book would be demoralizing if all it contained were the dismal journalism of beleaguered, quote, Orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists in the process of degeneration. The great virtue of this section is to show that a vibrant alternative existed at the time, articulating a coherent worldview and one that could have helped generate a healthy revolutionary left into the post-war period. Max Shachtman and his co-thinkers are not only politically astute, they are eminently readable and at times witty political satirists. Thus Shachtman in his debate with the Stalinist Earl Browder finished his contribution by mocking his opponent, previously a Communist Party leader, but one that had not been killed by Stalin. Shachtman's riposte, quote, "There but for an accident of geography stands a corpse," end quote. In another contribution, Shachtman exposed the nonsense of a, quote, "bureaucratic road to socialism," end quote. Shachtman wrote, quote, "I do not believe in the bureaucratic proletarian, socialist, revolution, I reject the concept not out of, quote, sentimental, end quote, reasons, or as a Tolstoyan, quote, faith in the people, end quote, but because I believe it to be scientifically correct to repeat with Marx that the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself, But the proletarian revolution cannot be made by others than the proletariat acting as a mass. There, and among other things, it is distinguished from all preceding revolutions. No one else can free it, not even for a day," end quote. Shachtman exposed the dreadful conflations of Isaac Deutscher, Trotsky's erudite biographer, but a flawed interpreter of Trotsky's politics. Deutscher was fascinated, quote, by undiscriminating, uncritical, unthought-out analogies between the bourgeois revolutions, the French in particular, but never the American, it is interesting to note, and the Bolshevik Revolution, end quote. Worse, Deutscher regarded Stalin as carrying out proletarian revolution, albeit in a bureaucratic way. This was the root confusion that showered the post-Trotskyist left in the post-war period. Shachtman asserted that whereas countless social forces paved the way for capitalism, only workers can make socialism. The book also sets out the kind of organization Shachtman wanted workers to build. It is integral to the working class, open and democratic. The party determines its line from the careful and constantly revised assessment of reality. Democratic debate is the means through which the party and the class clarifies its perspectives and charts its course. Shachtman propagated a conception of party building close to the original classical Marxist Bolshevik model, and far from the semi-Stalinist sects created by the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists ever since. There is more to the book than can be expressed in a short review. It is teeming with debate and political clarity. It articulates the renewal of socialism and warns of the pitfalls. It demands careful reading and repays conscientious study. To revive Marxism, the book both diagnoses the ailment and prescribes the cure. The debates may appear archaic, but learning from this period in our history is essential for the renewal of today's revolutionary Marxist left. The end. Paul Hampton is a socialist in London and a friend of workers' liberty. He is the author of, quote, Workers and Trade Unions for Climate Solidarity, Tackling Climate Change in a Neoliberal World, end quote. Thanks for listening.